Okay, the next talk is going to be by Kat Hobaiter from University of St. Andrews, who's joining us from, I think, Ugandan rainforest and is going to talk about ape communication. Kat, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone, and and allowing me to do this, I guess, remotely. Welcome to the nighttime in the Ugandan rainforest here, but I'm up in beautiful northwest Uganda. So I'm Kat. My research group is the Wild Minds Lab. We work on a pretty wide range of species and topics, but we're probably best known for our work on ape gestural communication. Now, it means a lot of what I'll talk about today is based in gesture data, but I think a lot of what we've been thinking about is actually relevant to many different species and communication systems. I've spent about 20 years working with wild apes, so it's a huge privilege to live out here in the rainforest about half the year. And it means that while I'm interested in questions around the evolution of human language, what I'm also really interested in is getting at questions to do with the apes themselves. I want to know what they're communicating about, what they're thinking about. Those are just as important to me. Uh, one of the most important things, just to say up front, is nothing I'll present to you today is my work alone. I work with an incredible team of people, and it's really only possible by putting all of this together. So I just want to put those guys up front and acknowledge that. But I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that when we're thinking about other species communication, we often ask, can they do what we do? What we should always try to remember is to also ask, can we do what they do? Because there are so many things that they can do that we cannot when communicating. So that might be communicating underwater or through ultrasound. And I think our perspective on animal communication can be impoverished when we take that human language centric perspective. But at the same time, language is our default system. It's one that is essential to how we think. And if we're interested in decoding animal communication, it's helpful to start out with the linguistic frameworks that we're intimately familiar with because we use them ourselves. Now, human language itself is an incredibly powerful tool, right? We can use it for all kinds of things. What I'm doing now, coming up with an idea and trying to share that idea with other people around. We use it for beautiful things, for poetry, for physics. We use it for ridiculous things like gossiping about our neighbors and putting stupid stuff on the internet. We can use it to inform each other, but it's just as effective as at deceiving each other. And I think one of the other things that it always pays to keep in mind is when we're thinking about other species communication, it's important to think about what that species needs to communicate. What is it doing with its communication? Now, a lot of species communication systems are what I would call broadcast. And it's a little bit like a radio. It can be very rich, very informative, but you are throwing information out without necessarily knowing much about your audience are doing. We make those same signals too. I'm broadcasting information all the time. And for example, if I pick up something that's too hot in the kitchen, I pick up a pan on the stove and I burn myself and yelp. If you're sat in the kitchen, you understand the pan is hot because you get the information and you are able to decode that meaning from the signal that I'm broadcasting. But I didn't intend to tell it to you. You know, what I would do with language is really quite different. I would, for example, 2 hours later, tell somebody who came into the kitchen to watch out, the pan is hot. So what I'm able to do with language is I can choose who to share ideas with, what ideas, how that information goes backwards and forwards as a dialogue in a very precise way. And it really revolutionized our understanding of non-human communication when we found that amongst other animal signals, ape gestures, of which they have over 100 different kinds, are used to communicate information between specific partners for particular goals in that intentional language-like fashion. Now, that's not to say they're the only species that does that. There are some of the chimpanzee calls and some other species gestures are intentional in a similar way, but it tends to be one or two quite specific signals that we find in other species And at least to date, it's only in ape gesture that we have this whole rich, incredible system of well over 100 units being used in this language-like way, and that allows us to explore language-like structures with ape gesture in a way that we can't yet necessarily with other species communication systems. Now, I was going to play you a video here, but we just worked out that my connection is not good enough. But what I was about to show you was what an ape gestural interaction looks like. And what you would have seen is you would have seen a male chimpanzee. He would have scratched himself. He would have then shaken a branch and he would have waited for a response. And the female chimpanzee he's gesturing at didn't do anything. She turned around, paid attention, but she didn't respond. So he repeats. He scratches, he shakes the same branch, and then he elaborates by raising his arm in that second case. And what that tells us again is this is not a broadcast signal interaction. And the analogy they use to compare language is if you imagine that I am asking you to pass me coffee at breakfast time. At that time, my need, the stimulus leading to the signal production, is a constant for caffeine in the morning. But I don't just broadcast coffee, 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 coffee at you. I would ask you to pass me the coffee. And because I recognize you as an individual and a social partner, I wait for your response. And if you don't do it, or you pass me the decaf or the tea, I would repeat, perhaps elaborate. And we see that same pattern of attending to a recipient, waiting for a response, persisting, and then elaborating as behavioral markers that we actually borrowed from the study of early human-infant communication and can effectively apply to other species communication to recognize these kind of linguistic interactions. I can also use those same things to decode what the signal means, because meaning is not about context. So I could have a gesture that means stop that, and I could use it when we're feeding, when we're fighting, when we're traveling. So context doesn't get you to what I mean to convey as an intentional act. Meaning can't be got at by just looking at what happens next, because if I signal, maybe what happens next is you tell me to get lost. And so what we do is we look for the behavioral change in the recipient that stops the signaler from signaling. And it's essentially like the one thing that will stop me asking you for coffee at breakfast time is when you pass me the coffee, right? So it's that change in behavior that clues us into what the signaler was intending to communicate. And if over hundreds of cases, thousands of cases, there is one or two outcomes that consistently, reliably stop me from signaling, then we can use that to infer what the signaler means to say. And we've been doing this kind of work for a long time. We built on work that started in the 1980s, and we took out to the wild to do this repertoire-wide kind of looks at gestural communication. And it's a beautiful, powerful system, but we've used fundamentally similar methods to address those questions for several decades. I think that we do have some new approaches that are available that we're able to push the field in some new directions. And that's what I'm excited to introduce to you just today. So I'm hoping to give you a whistle-stop tour, and I'll go light and fast, but if there's anything you're interested in, please reach out and I'm happy to go into more detail. Because the fundamental feature, that intentionality that was shared between language and ape gesture, meant the gesture seemed a really promising system. We were finding large repertoires of signals. We're finding flexible meaning. We're seeing them combined into structures and into combinations. But the more that we've worked on it, the more that I worried that this approach wasn't actually going to get us to the equivalent of what we've been trying to look for in terms of human-like meaning. That taking this approach of looking at the sort of tools in the communication toolkit, do you have units? Do they mean something? Do you combine them? Which is the classic comparative method we've applied for decades, is going to just give us the answer that many species have those same tools in common. And what is a more interesting perspective is to ask, how are they used? How do we and other species use those tools? What are they communicating for? And I love and overuse this quote by Sidney Brenner. He said, "The difference between the telephone directory and a Shakespeare play is that while both have a grand cast of characters, only the play has a plot." He was talking about DNA and the fact that it didn't fully encode the richness of human behavior, but it really works as an analogy for what I want to ask, which is that why humans have language is It's not about our linguistic toolkit. It is not the grand cast of characters. It is all about the plot. I think it's the way that identities, communication, that is characteristic of human language. And to compare that to other species, we have to get stuck into a different way of looking at their communication. So bear with me, because we're just going to have a little aside into some Gricean linguistics here. But a characteristic aspect of how humans create meaning is that there is a difference between what we would call timeless meaning and its occasion meaning. So the timeless meaning of a word or a gesture is what it means in general. It's a sort of average meaning across its uses. Occasion meaning is the meaning of a word under a particular set of circumstances. And that flexibility for the same word to mean something entirely different depending on context is a really distinctive feature of human communication. Now, to illustrate that, imagine you are driving along a country road in the dark at night and somebody flashes their lights at you, right? You assume they're trying to tell you something, but what? Because there's no direct correlation to something around you that means the same thing in every instance when we encounter this signal. So as well as maybe there's a timeless meaning that means something like, hey, pay attention, you have to be able to interpret what the driver wants you to understand on this specific occasion. So it could be a friend that recognizes you. It could be somebody indicating there is a problem with your car. It could be that there's a problem up ahead and you need to slow down. Your reaction has to be different in response to each of those messages. But we can work this out, and we do this all the time in social interactions, right? So you can check their car and it shows you that you don't recognize it, it's not a friend. You can check your car, it's not on fire, so it's not a problem. So probably the occasion meaning is there's danger up ahead, and this occasion you should slow down. So we are co-constructing a specific meaning together in the moment between the two parties to the conversation, as we say. And we do it all the time with language, as I was saying. We co-construct meaning depending on social context. So if I were to say the words nice shoes, if I just said hello, nice shoes, that's a compliment. If you just said, do you like my jacket? And I said nice shoes, the same words, the same intonation, the same prosody, but it means something completely different, right? Now, here is what I think the rub is. Our work on the structure of communication and comparative communication has been a great way to average meaning for decades in comparative communication. But so the characteristic use of meaning in language, which is occasion meaning. But I think we're promising areas where we can start to look at how great apes are using gestural tools on different occasions. And for example, we're now finding that ape meanings are flexible, but the specific occasion use can actually be disambiguated by context and recipient identity, the same way as we might incorporate pragmatic information into decoding occasion. And that's really encouraged us to get stuck into how variation impacts how individual apes are using their gestures.
Kat,
to do that,
Kat, yes. We're kind of hearing you now kind of broken up. Can you maybe stop your video broadcasting and then maybe thank you. Good morning, by the way, or good evening.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Hi. 1 second. If I go on to Skype, where's my stop video? Okay. And if I come to this one, can you hear me more clearly now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry about that. So what I was just saying is to tackle that kind of question, stuck into individual variation in signal use, you need big data sets. And we've been building them. We're finally at the point where we can start to play with it. We have over 25,000 gesture tokens, and we're looking across species, groups, landscapes, individuals, and generations. And we're also parsing how we describe gesture units into much greater detail. So we now code lots of different elements of the gesture's production, its flexion, its orientation, its articulator. And rather than predefine a gesture unit in advance, which is it's going to have an anthropocentric, what I think means gesture A is different from gesture B, we use those big data sets to extract patterns of consistent use by the apes, using things like latent cluster analyses to be able to define a repertoire of units that has boundaries. Detect almost double the number of discrete gesture units we thought wasn't. So it was a really useful exercise in taking a species-centric perspective. Now what we can do is look at things like, for example, how does group size and group cohesion, how do individual and social features shape communication? So for example, we could look at something like optimality. How is the communication system as a whole optimized depending on our social relationships? And here we have data from 3 communities of chimpanzees. And what we see is in that bottom group, Bosu, it is a small, highly cohesive group. And we see strong optimality, almost at the level of human language in that community. Sonso, that middle group, are very typical. They are basically the basic unicorns of chimpanzee society, mid-sized, classic fission fusion. And they have a middling kind of level of optimality. But really interestingly, up in Waibira, which is a supergroup, it's almost twice as large as your normal chimp group, and it has additional levels of social structure. We see counter-optimality, redundancy in communication. Now, that's interesting because investing excess energy is a sort of costly signaling. And we see the same pattern in human society, that as your group size and structure becomes more complex, you tend to produce more costly signals. We can also take a look at individual relationships. And we've been able to show with some preliminary data, this is still in prep, that the better you know someone, the more time you spend with them and the more time you spend interacting with them, the shorter you make your gestures. So you can have a sort of gestural shorthand in gesture production, depending on who you are gesturing to. Some variation is quite well known. So for example, chimpanzees drum on the big buttress roots of trees, and we can show they have an individual signature style. Now, that didn't come as a surprise to us. I can tell who's who when I hear somebody drumming in the forest. And if I can do it, I'm sure the chimps can. More interestingly is that we only found those individual signatures in traveling drums, not in display drums. Now that suggests the chimpanzees can flexibly encode their identity or not when they want to in their drumming signal. On the flip side, sometimes variation is really, we have no idea what's going on just yet. So here we have some data showing that West African chimpanzees are highly isochronous in their rhythmic use of percussive action. And so very, very clear, regular interbeat intervals, whereas East African chimpanzees are more fluid. They're the kind of jazz freestyle kind of rhythmic kind of communities. We have no idea why, but it is a stable, predictable feature of the communication between these different communities and these different subspecies. So there's definitely a there, and it's on us now to work it out. Finally, I'll just finish up by touching on something that we're thinking might be akin to a sort of cultural norm. And here we have Nora and Bahati. They're 2 chimps that were born in Sonso, which is where I'm sitting right now. They emigrated to Waibira, which was the neighboring group when they hit puberty, as chimps normally do. And one thing you need to know is that leaf clipping, tearing up leaves, is a chimpanzee sort of flirtation. Basically, if you're a boy interested in a girl, or occasionally a girl interested in a boy, you're going to tear a leaf, and that is you flirting. Basically, you're asking for sexual solicitation. But you can do it in different ways. You can tear it through the middle, you can tear it at one end, you can drop it silently, perhaps if you want to be a little bit sneaky. And when we compared the details of the gestural expression in the 2 communities, we see that Waibira are using the different forms, but tend to be leaf pull gesture users. And Sonso are very consistently leaf clip gesture users. So we get lovely stable group differences in the way a gesture can be expressed, which might represent something like a local dialect. It is the same gesture, it has the same core meaning, but it is expressed differently in a different way between the 2 neighboring groups. And actually, what we saw when we compared the data from those females who were born in Sonso and who moved to Waibira is that they didn't miss a beat. They sort of passed the when in Rome test of being able to correctly interpret and adjust to the communication style in the new community where they found themselves. So those were just a few flavors of what we've been doing. But I think to get at questions about whether or not the expression of human social intelligence that we see around us in language use is unique to humans or characteristic of humans, we have to move beyond just toolkits and explore social context of how we and other species are expressing and producing and using their signals day to day. And so I think that's going to be a really important step for us. And so social identity for me is key to decoding the plot in other apes' communication. I'm just going to finish very, very quickly and say that, as I mentioned, to try to tackle this type of question just takes unimaginably big data sets. It has been decades of work for us to build this, but we're starting to be able to offload some of the work that we have been doing, the manual labor, to machine learning algorithms. So we've been having some success using pose estimation to track video footage of wild chimpanzees. And you can see here, it is extremely noisy video footage. It really, everybody's moving, but we're starting to get there. And we've been able to successfully use this to, for example, track mouth movements in open mouth, closed lip smacking signals, to decode the fact that the rhythmic structures seem to be different in the different communities. And those models that we're building are translating well across communities. So this is a model trained on forest chimpanzees that is now translating well to detecting all of those chimpanzees in that savanna, but not the baboons. So, we're getting there, but we've got a long way to go. And I think some of these new approaches and new techniques are going to help us offset some of the cost of tackling the individual variation and the social context that I think is key to pushing comparative communication studies to the next level. I will stop talking there because I'm sure I've run over time, but thank you very much for your patience and for having me. And of course, thank you to all the fantastic field sites and the folk that fund us.
You able to take some questions? Yes.
I'd love to if we have time.
Yes, fantastic. Any questions for Kat?
Hey, Kat. So something that I feel was like a big topic over the last 4 weeks here at Simons is, whether language is for communication or for thought at its core. And I feel like everything you talked about is, like if there is a form of language among the apes, right? It's this gestural kind of communication and this maybe broadband like noise signals, but really person to person, the gestural stuff seems important. So I'm wondering what you think about that question, right? Do you think do apes think and, their gestures are just a reflection of this? If they do think, do they think in gestures? I don't know, just love to hear some, thoughts from you on this.
It's such an interesting question, right? And I, like everybody, that nature perspective that just came out had all of us talking out here in the forest too. I don't know. I'm tempted to consider whether or not it is a productive question and whether or not we're not really having this kind of nature-nurture debate. And we all know it's a bit of both. So is it a chicken and an egg? What did it start with? But I think there will be elements of perhaps how chimpanzees and apes think, or at least how they experience the world, that will structure their communication. And what I'm thinking of specifically is timing. It's a low-hanging fruit, but it's something that I think we might be able to ask questions about. So when I first started working with gorillas, I was constantly missing the responses because my perspective of the time frame a communication interaction should take place over was completely chimp-centric, which is very kind of back and forth. And gorillas just take their time. They live on what we call island time in the lab. Basically, gorillas are extremely kind of slow communicators. But anything about gorilla physiology, gorilla cognition, I wonder if gorillas essentially experience the concept of time differently to a chimpanzee. And it is that is making their responses a perfectly gorilla salient kind of time frame. So I know we're not quite getting it thinking in terms of concepts here, but I do think that there are ways in which we experience the world And that might influence things about our concept of something like time. What is an appropriate time to respond to a high-ranking individual as opposed to a low-ranking individual? Our concept of something like authority. So some of the things we've been thinking about are, could we detect like a polite imperative? So not just give me the food, but give me the food, please. And though if we can get a handle on that side of things and that type of data collection, it might allow us to ask questions about how what apes think shapes their communication. But I just don't know if we have the methods to do a good job of it yet. Sorry.
Hi, Kat. That was a really fascinating. This is Lucy Cheek from Cambridge. I wondered if you've seen any evidence in your groups of parents or caregivers trying to sort of teach or correct or shape the language development, the gestural development in the young animals.
Nothing obvious. And in some ways, I feel like if they could do it well, if it was something that they were doing regularly, we would see it all the time, right? It feels like the kind of thing where if you are going to have that as a part of your communication learning, it would be commonly observed. And so even if we saw it extremely rarely, I don't know what that would tell us. Now, I think there's good evidence that apes are able to potentially teach and share information. And we see that in extraordinary circumstances, like some of the captive kind of, or the enculturated apes. So the capacity seems there, but it's not something we see obviously done. I am really intrigued. I do think things like timing, for example, so you could, I guess, teach by example, teach by interaction. It might be more, a lot of what I would see with the apes I work with is what is described as master apprenticeship. So you afford the opportunity to watch from a proximity that you might not normally tolerate. You afford the opportunity to observe and take in information. And that in itself is sort of an adjustment in your own behavior, but you're not directly shaping the learner, basically.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a question from the YouTube chat. Lyra asks, my sense is that gossip is more than ridiculous. Is there a parallel behavior that we see among primates?
That's a good point, because I'm slightly, I was a bit dismissive of gossip at the beginning. I think gossip serves an incredibly important perspective. One of the things that I'm really interested in right now is storytelling and how that structures kind of our interactions, because I've been trying to think about what I think of as characteristically human. So if gossip is about, if the purpose of gossip is about reinforcing your social connections and social bonding, then apes have lots of ways of doing that. They just don't necessarily do it with their communication. And some of what I've been thinking about is if language use in, say, gossip and storytelling is about the formation of individual and group identity, which I think happens. So like your social relationship with somebody else and your social relationship with like our in-group as opposed to those guys over there. I think we might be able to see that kind of thing happening, but not necessarily in communication in apes. They might have other ways of marking that and recognizing that. I have anecdotally and very anecdotally seen sort of the equivalent of telling on somebody, which is we've had male chimpanzees who in one of our groups, we have a very strict hierarchy when it comes to access to females. And this male chimpanzee who was middle ranking, for example, the case I'm thinking of, had been waiting a really long time. He'd been very patient. And one of the lower ranking chimpanzees, when the higher ranking boys were distracted, sneaks off with the girl. And he throws a hissy fit, and he immediately goes to the high ranking males and then runs round the corner to basically where the kind of lower ranking guy and the girl are hidden around the bush. So it's not gossip, but that kind of social manipulation, perhaps informing, perhaps some level of kind of social policing, which I think gossip also has something to do with. Perhaps I've certainly seen examples that would fit with that. And now we have to think about how would we detect it? Where should we start looking for it? A lot of what I feel with the ape communication is that we don't necessarily look in the right places for like we look at something that is superficially similar to language, but we might be able to detect the same capacity in something that is superficially quite distinct from language sometimes.
I'm going to sneak in one more question because yesterday we had here Alison Gopnik, who is a developmental psychologist, and she has this idea that in earlier societies, maybe during the day, the parents, the grown-ups would spend all day complaining about other people not doing enough work. And then in the evening, it's when the allo parents and the grandparents take over and they start telling stories to the children around the campfire. And she thinks that's a way of like how cultural evolution and cultural transmission happens. And I know you have another stint going on with thinking about fire and storytelling. And I just was going to ask you to tell us just a little snippet of your thoughts about that.
I mean, they are the loosest of thoughts still at the moment. But yes, Alice, and I'm sure like what I've been thinking about, like Polly Wiesner, the anthropologist, essentially, her work that basically articulated the difference between the kinds of things you talk about around firelight in the evenings and the kind of things you talk about through the day being fundamentally different. And that the storytelling that goes on was essential to formation of individual and group identity. And that was quite distinct from what she termed mundane conversation. And I do think it's always bothered me. So I've been the primatologist. I've spent most of my career where people will put a line in the sand and say, okay, human language is like this, and I'll find a way to essentially show that characteristic in ape communication with intentionality, meaning, combinations. Like we can check all of those things off the list. And so that's been a large, like just blurring those lines has been something that we've all worked on so much for decades now, very successfully in many ways. But it's been at the same time extremely unsatisfying that the apes I work with are not writing King Lear, they are not putting people on the moon, they are not kind of doing what we do with language and trying to pinpoint what it is about our characteristic use of language that I don't think necessarily has to do with or at least they're only differences of degree and perhaps not kind. But I do think that the use of language and communication for social relationship and social identity formation in a fire-like context is a really interesting one. And it might also give us a little piece of the puzzle as to why, with all of the great apes, the kind of intentional communication we see most clearly, at least, is largely gestural, except humans. And what was it that pushed us from being gesturers to vocalizers as our default means for communicating with each other? Well, it's been proposed it was tool use, which I don't fully buy because yes, your hands are busy, you can't gesture, but frankly, your mouth is full when you're eating and you can't talk. Like it's a small proportion of the day. But if our characteristic use of communication emerged in fireside storytelling, then that low and flickering light context might actually offer a substantial advantage to vocalization as a medium that pushed us away from gesture. And being the only ape, all of the other modern apes kind of, still use gesture in that way. So I think there's a lot of things that are interesting about that fireside storytelling context that might speak to basically that evolutionary kind of shift out that we took when all of the modern ape species didn't. And I think, it's early days for us, but we're doing some experimental work around fire. We're starting to look at how social relationships and identities are formed in apes and looking at rhythm and ritual in that way as well. And just trying to kind of fill in the blanks on the map to see if we can start to trace the journey a little bit more clearly.
Perfect. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. I wish I was there, but I'm going to sign off.
Thanks for joining us
tonight now. So bye.